The hum of the Deep Space Observatory was a second heartbeat in the quiet of my isolated existence. A low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor plates, up my chair, and settled deep in my bones. It was a comforting sound, usually the symphony of highly calibrated instruments meticulously sifting through the universe's whispers. Tonight, though, it felt different, a little too insistent, perhaps. I leaned closer to the primary console, my breath fogging the cool glass for a moment before dissipating. The holographic display shimmered with the familiar mapping of the cosmos, a tapestry of nebulae and galaxies, each star a pinprick of potential. My new generation array, the Sentinel, was pointed at a region of space so utterly barren, it was a cosmic joke. The boot's void, a monstrous, nearly empty expanse, a gaping hole in the universe where galaxies simply weren't. It was a perfect control, a vast, silent canvas against which to measure the faintest background radiation, the most subtle distortions. Nothing was supposed to be there. Nothing. My fingers danced across the interface, adjusting filters, refining parameters. The air in the observation dome, usually crisp and cool, felt strangely heavy, clinging to my skin. I could smell the faint ozone tang of overworked electronics, mixed with the stale coffee I'd been nursing for hours. I preferred it this way, the isolation. Less interference, both cosmic and human. That's why the sudden spike made me flinch. It wasn't a burst, not a flare, nothing so dramatic. Just a single sharp deviation on the spectral analysis, a jagged peak tearing through the expected smooth baseline. It appeared, then vanished. A glitch, must be. The Sentinel was new, but no instrument was perfect. Cosmic rays, maybe. Or a stray bit of plasma from a solar flare that had managed to penetrate the outer layers of the atmosphere in just the wrong way. I exhaled slowly, pushing my spectacles further up the bridge of my nose. False positive, I muttered to the empty room, the sound swallowed by the persistent hum. I initiated a diagnostic sweep of the primary sensor array, watching the progress bar crawl across a secondary screen. Green lights blinked reassuringly. No errors detected. It did for a while. Hours passed. The initial unease, a fleeting prickle at the back of my neck, subsided. I shivered, pulling my worn wool sweater tighter. Then it happened again. Not a spike this time, more of a ripple. A low-frequency undulation that defied any known astrophysical phenomenon. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a ghost in the machine. But it was there, and it was repeating. Not a perfect loop, but a distinct, complex pattern of energy fluctuations. Like a sentence being spoken in a language I couldn't quite grasp. My fingers froze midair above the console. My gaze snapped to the coordinates. Ra 14H50M, deck plus 46 degrees 00. My voice was hoarse, dry. This wasn't a glitch. It was too intricate, too specific. The data streamed across my main display, a flood of numbers and graphs that normally would have filled me with scientific exhilaration. The signal wasn't repeating in a simple, predictable fashion like a pulsar or a quasar. It was evolving. Each pulse, each wave carried a subtle variation from the last, building upon itself like a vast, slow composition. It was information, a non-terrestrial presence. Not just a burst of energy, but something structured, something deliberate. And it was ancient. The redshift on the signal was staggering, placing its origin not just at the edge of observable space, but at the very dawn of the universe, billions upon billions of years ago. Yet it was still transmitting, still speaking. My mind, trained to find logical explanations for everything, scrambled. Equipment malfunction, a new class of cosmic noise, but the complexity, the sheer impossible design of it screamed otherwise. This wasn't random. This was a message, and it was coming from a place where nothing should exist. It was the same feeling I'd once had years ago, during a research trip to the remote reaches of the Amazon. I'd stumbled upon a temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it, a crumbling edifice of cyclopean stone half swallowed by the rainforest, its carvings depicting shapes and forms that defied any known human civilization, any terrestrial biology. This signal had that same quality, an ancient, profound wrongness. My determination, usually a steadfast anchor, felt like it was slipping. My hands, still trembling, hovered over the console, every fiber of my scientific being screamed to dismiss it, to classify it as an anomaly, an unresolvable error, and move on. It defied everything I knew, everything humanity had ever understood about the cosmos. But the sheer audacity of it, the impossible elegance of its structure, held me captive. A nagging, insidious curiosity, a dark whisper in the back of my mind compelled me. What if it wasn't an error? What if it was real? I took a deep, shuddering breath. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the otherwise silent dome. I couldn't ignore this. I couldn't just sweep it under the rug. Even if it was nonsense, it was fascinating nonsense. With a resolve that felt less like scientific rigor and more like a surrender to an unknown current, I initiated the logging sequence. The data stream, billions of years in the making, began to archive. What would I do with it? What could I even call it? And what precisely was it trying to say? The hum of the Deep Space Observatory, a familiar bass note in the symphony of my work, settled into my bones as I leaned closer to the monitor. The initial anomaly, a fleeting blip against the backdrop of cosmic white noise, had coalesced into something more. I'd spent the last 36 hours, fueled by stale coffee and a growing, prickly unease, dissecting the data. My eyes burned, the screen's cool blue light reflecting off their tired surfaces. What I'd found defied every assumption. The signal wasn't random. That was the first, undeniable truth. My algorithms, designed to filter out solar flares, planetary interference, and the endless hiss of the universe, kept returning patterns. Not simple, repetitive pulses like a dying star, nor the complex, yet predictable, modulations of a pulsar. This was something else entirely. It wove and twisted through the spectrum, a labyrinth of frequencies that shifted with an unnerving, almost deliberate grace. I isolated sections, running Fourier transforms, wavelet analyzers, every mathematical tool in my arsenal. Each time the results were the same, an impossibly intricate structure, layered and interlocking, yet utterly devoid of any recognizable sequence. No prime numbers, no Fibonacci spirals, no mathematical constant I could identify. It wasn't a language in any sense I understood, yet it possessed an undeniable grammar. A cold prickle ran up my spine. It was like staring at a tapestry woven from light itself, each thread a shimmering frequency, but with no discernible image, no story, just an overwhelming, bewildering complexity. It suggested an intelligence, yes, but one so utterly alien that its very thought processes were beyond my comprehension. It wasn't trying to communicate. It was simply being. Days bled into nights. I ate at my console, the metallic tang of lukewarm instant noodles a constant companion to the faint ozone smell of the electronics. My colleagues, the few who ever ventured into my isolated corner of the facility, stopped by less frequently. A junior analyst, fresh-faced and eager, paused one afternoon. "Anything interesting, Raj?" he asked, his voice bright, utterly oblivious. I mumbled something about a complex spectral anomaly, my gaze fixed on the scrolling waveforms. He nodded, probably used to my terse responses, and eventually drifted away, his footsteps echoing down the sterile corridor. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him that interesting was a profound understatement. That anomaly felt like calling a supernova a bright spark. The signal began to feel less like data and more like a presence. It wasn't radiating energy in a way that fit any astrophysical model. It was too stable, too precise, too clean. It hummed through the observatory's systems, a constant, low-frequency thrum that I started to feel not just in my bones, but in my very skull. It was a pressure behind my eyes, a subtle vibration in the air. I found myself unconsciously adjusting my posture, trying to lean away from the monitors, as if the sheer density of its unknown information could physically press against me. My sleep became fractured, haunted by abstract patterns of light and shadow that mirrored the signal's structure. I'd wake in a sweat, my heart thudding, the phantom hum still resonating in my ears. The logical part of my brain screamed for a natural explanation, for a mundane error, for anything that would bring it back into the realm of the known. But the data refused to yield. It remained stubbornly, terrifyingly itself. The isolation deepened. I stopped answering calls, ignored emails. The outside world, with its petty concerns and predictable physics, felt distant, irrelevant. Only the signal mattered. It became my singular focus, a vast, silent, intelligent enigma that seemed to mock every scientific principle I held dear. One evening, sifting through an obscure database of ancient Earth anomalies, a desperate, almost irrational detour. Grasping at straws, a particular entry snagged my attention. It was a collection of fragmented ethnographic notes, dismissed by mainstream archaeology, detailing strange symbols etched into stone found in a remote corner of the world. The notes spoke of a temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. The description was vague, steeped in superstition and fear. It detailed carvings unlike any other, said to predate known civilizations, linked to an unnamed presence that watched from beyond the stars. My scientific mind scoffed, of course. Coincidence, pareidolia. My mind was making connections where none existed, desperate for an anchor. Yet the image of those carvings, the feeling of their complexity, gnawed at me. The signal had begun to subtly reshape my thoughts, to nudge my perceptions, find the other echoes. A sudden, almost violent compulsion seized me. I needed to see those carvings. I needed to stand before them, to feel the same air that had once brushed against the hands that etched those impassable designs. Was it the signal driving me, or was my sanity fraying under the strain? I didn't know. I only knew I had to go. The journey was a blur of cramped flights, dusty roads, and finally a small, sputtering boat up a murky river. The air grew thick and humid, heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth. The vibrant green of the jungle pressed in, a suffocating wall of life. The local boatman, a weathered man with eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, simply shook his head when I mentioned the temple. He stopped speaking altogether as we neared the coordinates I'd painstakingly cross-referenced from the old notes. His knuckles were white on the tiller. We disembarked onto a muddy bank, the air buzzing with unseen insects. The jungle pulsed around me, a living, breathing thing. Then, through a sudden clearing, I saw it. It wasn't grand or imposing in the way of ancient wonders, but its silence was profound, almost reverent. And on its weathered, crumbling surface, even from a distance, I could make out the faint, impassable etchings that had haunted my sleepless nights. A shiver, unrelated to the damp air, traced its way down my spine. The humid air clung to me like a shroud, a constant, oppressive weight against my skin. Sweat slicked my forehead, stinging my eyes as I pushed through the dense foliage. The path, if one could call it that, was barely a game trail, twisting deeper into the jungle. Every few steps, I swatted at unseen insects, their buzzing a maddening chorus around my ears. I hadn't slept properly in days, the signal an incessant hum behind my thoughts, urging me on, a silent, relentless current pulling me towards the impassable. I was going to the temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. A place whispered about in hushed tones, dismissed as superstition by anyone with a shred of reason. But reason had abandoned me weeks ago. The guide I'd hired, a weathered man with eyes that seemed to hold generations of quiet fear, had dropped me off at the edge of the known paths, refusing to go any further. He simply pointed, his hand trembling slightly, and muttered something about the old ones before turning his back and disappearing into the trees without another word. I was alone now, the jungle pressing in, a living, breathing entity that seemed to watch my every move. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something subtly metallic and acrid, like old copper left in the rain. After what felt like an eternity, the canopy thinned slightly, revealing a hulking, moss-covered structure that seemed to have grown organically from the earth itself. Vines snaked across every surface, pulling at the seams, slowly reclaiming what man had built. But it was the carvings that seized my attention, just as I knew they would. They covered every visible inch of the stone, patterns of impassable angles and non-Euclidean geometries, twisting and interlocking in ways that defied visual logic. My eyes tried to trace them, to make sense of the lines, but they seemed to shift, to subtly rearrange themselves the longer I stared, inducing a faint nausea that churned in my stomach. I stepped through a gaping archway, the air inside immediately cooler, heavier, silent in a way the jungle never was. The only sound was the drip of water from some unseen source, echoing off the ancient walls. My digital recorder, usually a reliable piece of equipment, crackled to life in my hand, then died, the screen flickering into a series of meaningless symbols before going black. I tapped it, shook it, but it remained inert. Just the humidity, I told myself, though a prickle of unease started to crawl up my spine. I pulled out my phone for light, but its screen too began to strobe, a blinding white flash followed by deep violet, then nothing. The electronic silence was absolute. As I ventured deeper, the carvings grew more intricate, more disturbing. They depicted figures that were not quite human nor beast, but something in between or perhaps beyond. Multi-limbed, faceless, Their forms seemed to writhe and contort, frozen in stone, yet imbued with a terrible implied motion. It was not a language I knew, yet it resonated with the same unsettling rhythm as the signal I had been studying. My breath hitched. Was it the wind, the creaking of the old structure, or was my mind finally playing tricks on me? My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a chamber at the heart of the temple. Here, the carvings were even more elaborate, focused on a central altar-like slab of polished black stone. Scattered around it were various artifacts, crude clay tablets, scrolls of brittle, unknown parchment, and oddly shaped stone implements. The whisper intensified, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a dizzying sensation that threatened to buckle my knees. For a fleeting second, the walls around me seemed to ripple, the stone carvings dissolving into a swirling vortex of impossible color and depth, before snapping back into their inert forms. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again, my heart racing. Just my mind, overstimulated, I reasoned, but the conviction felt thin. I picked up one of the clay tablets. Its surface was covered in symbols similar to the carvings on the walls, but arranged in what appeared to be lines of text. Many symbols were unknown to me, but a few seemed to echo ancient proto-languages I had studied in passing. With a meticulous, almost frantic energy, I began to photograph them with my now-working analog camera, the only device that seemed immune to whatever was affecting the temple. The parchment scrolls were even more fragile, crumbling at the edges, but some were preserved enough for me to discern faint drawings and what looked like a primitive form of script. They detailed rituals, sacrifices, and a strange, recurring motif of shapes that uncannily resembled the geometric patterns of the signal I had discovered. My hands trembled as I held a particularly well-preserved scroll, its brittle surface depicting a crude map of the cosmos, but with a gaping, inky blackness at its heart, surrounded by symbols I now recognized as the signal's signature. Beside it, a grotesque, multi-eyed figure seemed to gaze out from the parchment, its silent stare piercing me. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the chamber, making me jump. A fresh fissure had appeared in the stone wall near the altar, spiderwebbing across one of the most intricate carvings. From the crack, a thin, black viscous liquid began to seep, glistening wetly in my flashlight beam. It didn't look like water. It didn't smell like anything natural. And as it pooled on the cold stone floor, the whispering seemed to rise to a fever pitch, a cacophony of unseen voices pressing in on me from every direction. What was seeping from the heart of this ancient place? And what was it trying to tell me? Every few steps, I swatted at unseen insects, their buzzing a persistent hum in my ears, blending with the drip of moisture from the canopy and the distant, guttural cries of unseen creatures. My clothes, soaked through, chafed against my skin, but I ignored the discomfort. The coordinates were etched into my mind, a beacon drawing me onward, deeper into this green, suffocating labyrinth. Then, through a curtain of hanging vines and broad, waxy leaves, I saw it. The temple in jungle locals refused to speak of it. It wasn't a structure that rose majestically. Rather, it seemed to sag, a monumental weight pressing into the earth, consumed by the jungle's voracious embrace. Stone blocks, carved with symbols I couldn't decipher from this distance, were choked by roots thicker than my arm, their surfaces slick with moss and dark with centuries of damp. It was as if the very air refused to carry sound near its ancient stones. What could make an entire ecosystem hold its breath? I stepped through the archway. The air inside was thick with the scent of wet earth, decaying stone, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood or ozone. My footsteps echoed, swallowed quickly by the vastness of the chamber. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing walls covered in intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of my vision. They weren't recognizable glyphs. They were more like elaborate distortions, geometric impossibilities woven into the very fabric of the stone. The signal, faint but insistent, pulsed through the air, confirming my location. It was here. It had always been here. Sleep was a shallow, restless thing. The jungle sounds were muted here, replaced by the drip of water from unseen crevices and the soft scuttling of unseen things. My mind, however, refused to quiet. I drifted into a dream, not of stars or equations, but of impossible spaces. Before me, structures began to coalesce, Not solid forms, but shifting geometries, polygons folding into impossible angles, planes intersecting where they shouldn't. They pulsed with an internal light, a silent thrum that vibrated in my chest, not my ears. Then in the vastness beyond these shifting forms, I felt it, a presence, not a being with eyes or limbs, but an immense, crushing awareness, like the universe itself had turned its gaze upon me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. What was this awful, silent observer? I jolted awake, gasping, my heart racing. The dream clung to the edges of my perception, a lingering scent of ozone and the echo of that impossible geometry. My hands trembled as I reached for my canteen, the plastic cool against my clammy fingers. I ran a hand through my damp hair, trying to rationalize it away. Just a dream, I told myself, a product of an overactive mind and too much jungle heat. But the feeling of being watched persisted, a prickle on the back of my neck. I spent the next few hours meticulously checking my equipment, recalibrating the receiver, ensuring every connection was secure. The signal was stronger here, clearer, a relentless rhythmic pulse. It wasn't just data anymore. It felt like a presence, a hum that resonated deep within my own skull. As I leaned over the console, adjusting a dial, a flicker caught my eye. The rough stone wall opposite me seemed to ripple, the moss-covered surface momentarily dissolving into a cascade of those same impossible angles from my dream. A flash of bruised purple, a sliver of incandescent green. And then it was gone, replaced by the familiar grimy stone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. My vision swam. Had I truly seen it, or was my mind finally succumbing to the strain? A low thrum vibrated through the floor, a soundless vibration that I felt more than heard. It wasn't the receiver that hummed a different tune. This was deeper, resonating in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. I pressed my palms against my temples, the pressure building, a dull ache behind my eyes. I focused on a single point on the wall, a patch of intricate carving, trying to steady my racing thoughts. But the carving began to distort, the lines blurring, then reforming into patterns that made my stomach clench. They weren't just patterns, they were equations of perception, rules of space unraveling before my very eyes. My mind struggled to comprehend what my eyes were seeing, the two faculties at war. The geometry wasn't simply complex, it was wrong. Defying every principle of three-dimensional space I knew, it felt like looking into a wound in reality. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair with a clatter that sounded deafening in the temple's quiet. My breath hitched in my throat. My hands shook uncontrollably, a tremor that started in my fingers and ran up my arms, seizing my entire frame. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was the signal, somehow, reaching directly into my mind, bypassing my ears and eyes, twisting my very perception of what was real. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat in time with the signal's pulse. What was it trying to show me, and what would be left of me when it was done? Every few steps, I swatted at unseen insects, their buzzing a persistent hum in my ears. The canopy above was so thick, only slivers of sunlight pierced through, painting shifting patterns on the damp earth. The scent of decay and rich soil filled my nostrils, a heavy, primal perfume. My boots sank into the mud with each step, sucking at my resolve. But the image of the temple, whispered about by the locals with a mixture of fear and reverence, pulled me forward. They refused to speak of it directly, their eyes darting away when I pressed, their voices dropping to hushed tones that suggested something ancient and best left undisturbed. That only fueled my curiosity, a desperate need to find something that could anchor the unanchored truth of the signal. My colleagues had scoffed, but the signal didn't lie, and now neither would I. Hours bled into an eternity, my calves ached, my throat felt raw, then through a sudden break in the trees a silhouette emerged. Not a natural one, a structure. This was the temple in jungle, locals refused to speak of it. I stumbled towards it, my breath catching in my chest. The buzzing of insects faded. Even the rustle of leaves seemed to cease. A vast, crumbling archway, adorned with eroded carvings that hinted at something serpentine and multi-limbed, marked the entrance. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through cracks in the ceiling. My footsteps echoed, each one a sharp intrusion. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, sweeping over walls covered in more carvings, not the crude, familiar symbols of human civilization. These were alien, geometric patterns that seemed to shift at the edges of my vision, interlocking lines that implied impassable angles and infinite recursion. I felt a prickle on my skin, the hairs on my arms rising. There was a low hum, not from the jungle, but from the stone itself, a vibration that resonated deep in my bones. It felt like the signal, a faint, distant echo of its presence. In the deepest chamber, past collapsed pillars and heaps of rubble, I found it. A central altar, not for sacrifice, but for something else. Etched into its surface was a diagram, intricate and vast. My signal, it wasn't a star, it wasn't a galaxy. It was a thing, drawn on an ancient altar in a forgotten temple, a thing that had no business existing. I spent another day there, tracing the lines, taking photographs with my phone, though I doubted they would capture the unsettling feel of the place. The hum intensified when I touched the carvings, a low thrum that vibrated up my arm, making my teeth ache. I copied symbols, filled notebooks with frantic sketches, my mind reeling with the implications. The jungle itself seemed to watch me, silent, unmoving. Was I truly alone? Back in civilization, the shift was jarring. The sterile white walls of the research facility felt confining after the jungle's vastness. My colleagues, initially curious about my extended absence, grew visibly uncomfortable as I tried to explain. My office, usually a sanctuary of quiet focus, became a cage of my own making. "Look at this," I urged a colleague, pointing a trembling finger at a projection of the temple carvings. Right there, they knew. The colleague, a sharp-eyed woman who usually met my wilder theories with a wry smile, just stared. This looks like a local folk art interpretation of a supernova, perhaps, or even just abstract patterns. I shook my head violently. No, I don't understand. The patterns, the geometry, it matches the signal's modulation. The structure of the signal, this temple, it predates any known astronomical observation of this kind. They couldn't have known, not unless. I saw the flicker of concern in her eyes, quickly followed by something else. Pity. It was worse than skepticism. Pity implied I was beyond reason. My subsequent presentations were disasters. I spoke with a fervor I couldn't control, my words tumbling out in a rush, connecting ancient myths, forgotten civilizations, and the impossible cosmic entity. I presented the data from the signal, undeniably real, alongside the crude photos from the temple. The juxtaposition, which to me was terrifying proof, to them was evidence of a mind unraveling. The senior researcher, a man whose respect I had always valued, leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Raj," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "the data is compelling, but my interpretations, they are highly unconventional, and these drawings, they have no place in a scientific discourse." "They do have a place," I insisted, my voice rising, "because they explain what my conventional science can't." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Faces turned away. Colleagues avoided my gaze. The questions they asked were no longer about the signal, but about my health, my sleep, my stress levels. I was being dismissed, not just my theories, but me. The isolation I had always embraced now felt like an imposed exile. The doors to collaborative projects closed. Emails went unanswered. I became a ghost in the halls, my presence tolerated but my words ignored. My determined hunt for answers intensified, fueled by a desperate, gnawing hunger. If they wouldn't listen, I would find others who had listened generations ago. I delved into the forgotten corners of the university library, dust motes dancing in the dim light of the stacks. I scoured obscure online archives, forums dedicated to fringe history and esoteric beliefs. I sought out texts the scientific community had long discarded as superstition or madness. Books bound in brittle leather, their pages yellowed and smelling of mildew, became my companions. My fingers, smudged with ink and dust, traced over faded woodcuts depicting impossible geometries, entities that defied terrestrial biology, vast and indifferent. I started seeing patterns, recurring symbols, a common thread of something immense, something other, lurking just beyond the edge of perception. It described a presence that was not alive in any way we understood, but rather existed profoundly and eternally, indifferent to the fragile order of the universe. I flipped to an accompanying illustration. It was abstract yet sickeningly familiar. It was the signal, it was the temple, it was the thing that whispered to me from the void, and it had a name, or at least something akin to one. What did these ancients know that we had forgotten, and why did their knowledge feel so much like a premonition? The hum of the servers was my only company, a low, mechanical thrum that had once been soothing, now felt like a taunt. After the hushed whispers and averted gazes of my colleagues, the lab had become a sanctuary, a bunker against the world that was so eager to dismiss what it couldn't comprehend. They saw a man unraveling. I saw the universe finally revealing its true face. My determination, honed by years of solitude and focused pursuit, had solidified into something sharper, colder. Let them talk. I had a signal to break. My screens glowed, a constellation of data points and spectral analyzers. The raw signal, an impossibly complex waveform, pulsed at the center of my primary display. I'd spent countless hours feeding it through every known algorithm, every theoretical framework. It wasn't a radio wave, not light, not anything electromagnetic. It defied classification, yet it carried information. I could feel its weight, its presence, even if I couldn't yet read its words. What if it wasn't a language in the human sense? What if it bypassed syntax and grammar, delivering concepts directly? I remembered a half-forgotten paper, a fringe theory about information transfer at quantum scales, bypassing traditional encoding. It was a long shot, a desperate reach, but desperation was all I had left. It was like trying to find meaning in the way dust motes danced in a sunbeam, assuming the dance was the message. Days blurred into nights. Coffee became a distant memory, replaced by the metallic tang of exhaustion in my mouth. My eyes burned, but I couldn't tear them away from the swirling visualizations. The algorithm churned, processing petabytes of data, searching for an echo, a resonance, anything that wasn't random noise. And then a flicker. A pattern too subtle for the human eye, but the algorithm highlighted it, a recurring sequence of energetic interactions that defied entropic decay. It wasn't a word or a number, it was a structure. I zoomed in, isolating the sequence. It pulsed, a fractal geometry of pure energy. My breath hitched. This wasn't a signal from something, it felt like a signal of something. I adjusted the parameters, urging the parsing engine to interpret this structure not as data, but as a conceptual framework. The screens flickered, colors shifting, the hum of the servers deepening, almost vibrating in my chest. What was I asking it to do? To translate the untranslatable? A wave of dizziness washed over me. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with an unidentifiable scent, something like ozone mixed with ancient dust and damp earth. My skin prickled. The visual representations on the screens began to warp, the fractal structure expanding, invading my peripheral vision. It wasn't just on the monitors anymore, it was everywhere. Then, a sudden, blinding flash, not of light, but of understanding. It wasn't a deciphered message I read, but a direct download, a conceptual torrent that bypassed my eyes and ears and flooded my mind. My knees buckled. I gripped the edge of my desk, gripped tight. I was no longer in the sterile confines of my lab. The air was thick and humid, clinging to my skin, tasting of decay and teeming life. The overwhelming scent of wet soil, rotting leaves, and something else, something ancient and vegetal, filled my nostrils. Giant, gnarled roots snaked across the ground, thick as pythons, disappearing into an impenetrable wall of green. Overhead, a canopy so dense it swallowed the sky, leaving only slivers of bruised light. Through the tangled foliage, a structure loomed. It was a temple, impossibly old, not carved from stone, but seemingly grown from the earth itself, its massive blocks eroded by millennia of rain and time. Vines, thick as my arm, wrestled with its crumbling facade, pulling it deeper into the embrace of the wild. There were no sharp angles, no familiar architectural designs. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that locals refused to speak of it. They knew its truth, or perhaps, they merely knew its name and feared what that name invoked. This was not a vision I was having. It was a truth I was perceiving, a memory seared into the fabric of the universe, now downloaded directly into my mind. The temple was not merely a structure, it was a point of contact, a nexus, a scar on the world where something incomprehensible had once, or perhaps still, touched. Humanity was a fleeting thought, a momentary ripple on an ocean of cosmic indifference. The universe wasn't empty, it was full of presences that dwarfed our understanding, entities that predated stars, that regarded our entire existence with less interest than we might a fleeting dust mote. Our struggles, our triumphs, our sciences, our very perception of reality, all were insignificant, a self-congratulatory delusion played out on a speck of cosmic dust. The true nature of existence was not the ordered, logical cosmos I had studied, but a boundless, churning chaos of slumbering titans, their dreams and stirrings occasionally brushing against the thin veil of our reality. The temple in the jungle was a testament to one such brush, a lingering echo. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably, a fine tremor that shook my entire frame. I felt a scream building in my chest, but no sound escaped. My throat was dry, tasting of ash. The lab, my sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell, a paper-thin illusion. The hum of the servers, once comforting, now sounded like a distant, mocking laugh. My carefully constructed world, my entire understanding of being, was not merely challenged. It was obliterated. What was this signal? What other truths lay hidden within its terrifying depths? The deepening influence, the hum of the servers, was my only company. A low, mechanical thrum that had once been soothing, now felt like a taunt. 2 weeks had bled into each other, the fluorescent lights of the data center my only sun. My body had become a vessel for the work, the signal, a relentless current that coursed through my thoughts, replacing the need for sleep with an insistent, gnawing hunger for more data. I hadn't seen the sky in days. My reflection in the monitor's dark glass showed a stranger, skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, eyes sunk deep into bruised hollows, rimmed with a perpetual, feverish glint. The tremor in my left hand had become constant, a subtle vibration that never quite settled. Food tasted like ash, if I remembered to eat at all. A colleague, the quiet one who sometimes left a thermos of lukewarm tea on my desk, had asked me, his voice carefully neutral, if I was all right. I had simply stared, the question meaningless, the concept of all right a distant shore. I no longer saw the point in reaching. What was all right when the universe was screaming something so profound, so utterly other? The deciphered fragments of the signal had begun to coalesce into something like language, or perhaps a pattern of understanding that bypassed language entirely. It wasn't a message in the human sense, but a series of resonant frequencies, a complex vibration that restructured thought itself. It spoke of deep time, of structures so vast they made galaxies seem like motes of dust, and it spoke of presences, not entities, not beings, but presences that were not contained by space or time as I knew it. They were simply there, always had been, always would be. Like the fundamental laws of existence, only sentient. My perception began to fray around the edges. It started subtly. The flickering of the lab lights, which I'd always attributed to aging infrastructure, now seemed to possess a rhythmic irregularity, a pulse that didn't quite match the electrical current. The smooth, sterile white walls of the lab sometimes seemed to shimmer, the surface briefly rippling like disturbed water before settling back into inert solidity. I'd rub my eyes, convinced it was fatigue, the strain of staring at screens for so long, but the sensation persisted, a ghost in my peripheral vision. One afternoon, I was hunched over a console, tracing a newly revealed harmonic sequence when the shadow of the server rack behind me seemed to deepen, to thicken. It wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical weight, a denser texture to the air within its boundaries. I glanced back, my neck stiff. The rack was just a rack, metal and blinking lights. The linoleum tiles, usually a uniform gray, seemed to warp, the lines of their seams bending inward, converging on a point that wasn't there. My breath hitched. I stood up slowly, a dull ache in my knees. The distortion held, a subtle, almost imperceptible dip in the floor, a tiny vortex in the mundane. I walked towards it, my footsteps loud in the quiet lab. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Had I imagined it? My hand trembled as I pressed it against the cool metal of the server. No, I hadn't. The signal was doing this. It wasn't just data I was processing. It was a corrosive agent, dissolving the membrane between what I knew and what was. The world wasn't stable. It was a projection, a thin skin over something else, something vast and indifferent. The signal wasn't revealing truths about the universe. It was revealing the true universe, the one hidden beneath our fragile human understanding. And that true universe was beginning to bleed through. This new perception extended beyond the lab. In the rare moments I ventured out, the city seemed wrong. Buildings leaned imperceptibly, the roar of traffic held a dissonant undertone, a low, guttural thrum beneath the everyday cacophony. People moved too fast, their faces a blur, their concerns trivial, like insects scurrying on a colossal, unaware beast. Their lives, their joys, their sorrows, they were all just static, noise against the immense, silent symphony the signal was playing. Then, buried deep within a newly deciphered layer of the signal's patterns, a recurring motif emerged. It wasn't a visual image, nor an auditory one, but a complex, multidimensional signature that resonated with something ancient, something terrestrial. It led me down rabbit holes of forgotten histories, obscure archaeological reports, and cryptic folklore. My search led me to a few fragmented texts, dusty academic papers that spoke of impossible geometry and a strange, non-Euclidean architecture. They pointed with an almost fearful reverence to a place no one dared speak of directly. It was a structure, an edifice not built by human hands, but merely found by them deep within the humid embrace of a forgotten land. The texts were vague, almost deliberately so, but the resonance with the signal was undeniable. The patterns matched, the frequencies aligned. It was a terrestrial echo of the cosmic truth, a ground-based anchor for the impossible geometries that the signal was now showing me. I knew with a certainty that bypassed logic where I had to go. The lab, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage, too small for the truths I was uncovering. I started packing, a small bag, a few essentials, my research notes, the ones I'd hidden away, encoded in a system only I understood. The thought of leaving the signal, even for a short time, was a physical wrench, a phantom limb being torn away. But the pull of this new revelation was stronger, an imperative that superseded all else. My journey took days, then weeks. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth. The ground under my worn boots was slick with mud, roots like grasping fingers snaking across my path. The buzzing of unseen insects was a constant, irritating drone. I pushed through dense foliage, guided by an internal compass that had nothing to do with magnetic north, everything to do with the signal's persistent hum in my mind. The local guides, hired through a series of increasingly desperate contacts, had grown agitated as we neared our destination. Their eyes, once curious, were now wide with a fear I didn't understand, but recognized as ancient and profound. Their words were indecipherable to me, but their gestures, their sudden, absolute refusal to go any further were not. They would not speak of it, not a single word. I stood alone at the edge of a clearing, the dense canopy momentarily parting to reveal a sliver of gray sky. Before me, half swallowed by the relentless jungle, was the temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. Its stones were the color of old bone. Massive blocks fitted together with impossible precision, forming angles that defied the natural world, that seemed to twist and fold in on themselves even as I stared. No human could have carved these lines, no human could have lifted these megaliths. It pulsed with the same silent, resonant frequency as the signal in my head. What ancient, slumbering truth lay entombed within its impassable walls? I ignored the emails from the director, the thinly veiled threats about funding, the persistent requests for an explanation I couldn't articulate without sounding unhinged. They saw static, I saw a language. For weeks, the signal had been a puzzle, a magnificent, terrifying riddle. I had pored over the data, sifting through the layers of noise, the impossible frequencies, the patterns that defied any known cosmic origin. My initial assumption that it was merely an observation, a passive emanation from an impossibly distant, lifeless void, had begun to fray. The patterns weren't random. They weren't even truly complex in a mathematical sense. They were deliberate. It wasn't just sending information, it was reaching. It started with subtle shifts in the signal's modulation, tiny inflections I'd initially dismissed as instrumental drift. But then, as I stripped away more layers, isolating the core frequency, I detected a resonance, a mirroring. It wasn't echoing my probes, not exactly. It was responding. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the monitor, the greenish glow reflecting in my wide eyes. The signal wasn't just an anomaly, it was a beckoning, a call, not a shout, but a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate not just the air in the lab, but the very marrow in my bones. It felt like a subtle invitation, an ancient, patient lure from something that had been waiting, perhaps for eons, for a receptive mind. The isolation of the lab became less a refuge and more a crucible. My colleagues were a cacophony of doubt, their skepticism a deafening static. They couldn't hear the subtle shift, the almost imperceptible turning of the signal from observation to interaction. They were blind to the entity's slow, deliberate awakening. But I saw it, I felt it. The entity wasn't just out there, it was reaching in. I started to read, devouring texts far removed from astrophysics. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Had ancient peoples somehow perceived this same call, albeit through a different lens? The thought terrified me, but it also solidified my resolve. If they could perceive it, I could connect to it. I had to. My current equipment, powerful as it was, could only passively receive. To truly understand, to truly engage, I needed to go further. I needed to bridge the gap, not just electronically, but fundamentally. I spent days locked away, sketching diagrams, running simulations, my hands shaking with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. My experimental method wasn't about amplifying the signal itself. It was about amplifying my perception of it, about making my own consciousness a more finely tuned receiver. It was a dangerous, almost suicidal endeavor. I cannibalized parts from decommissioned arrays, bypassed safety protocols, and rewired circuits with a frantic urgency. The core of my new setup involved a neural interface, a crude but potent device I'd once designed for theoretical brain-computer interaction, now repurposed for something far more perilous. It would feed the raw, unfiltered data streamed directly into my auditory cortex, my visual centers, perhaps even deeper. It would bypass the filters of conscious thought, the safeguards of sanity. The risk of complete mental collapse was not just acknowledged, it was assumed. My hands trembled as I connected the delicate wires to the interface. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and my own sweat. This wasn't science in the traditional sense anymore. This was a desperate attempt to hear the true voice of something ancient and vast, something that had been patiently calling across the cosmos and was now, finally, finding its answer. My fingers hovered over the activation switch. What would I hear? What would I see? And once I opened that channel, could I ever truly close it again? I had spent weeks, perhaps months, locked in, refining my equipment, chasing the phantom signal. It wasn't enough. The data, no matter how precise, felt like peering through a keyhole at an ocean. I needed more than data. I needed proximity, a conduit. The breakthrough came not from a calculation, but from a forgotten archive, a tattered journal from a long-discredited anthropologist. Tucked between scribbled notes on ancient rituals and crude diagrams of celestial alignments, I found it. A recurring symbol, a resonant frequency, and coordinates that, when cross-referenced with my own evolving spectral maps, pointed to a single, impossible location. A place whispered about in hushed tones, avoided by all who knew its name. A place beyond the reach of satellite dishes and fiber optic cables. I packed light. My custom-built receiver, a tangle of wires and sensitive crystals, was the heaviest burden. The journey was a blur of cramped flights, jostling jeeps, and finally, a slow, arduous trek on foot. The air grew thick, humid, pressing in like a physical weight. Insects buzzed a relentless symphony around my ears, and the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled my nostrils. A primal perfume, every rustle in the undergrowth made my skin prickle. Days bled into one another. My clothes clung to me, perpetually damp. I rationed my water, my throat raw. The path, if it could be called that, was barely visible, often just a memory of crushed foliage. Then through a sudden break in the canopy, I saw it. Not a structure, not initially. It was an absence, a clearing that felt too deliberate, too ancient to be natural. And in its heart, half consumed by vines and the relentless press of time, stood the temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. It wasn't built for human hands. Twisted roots snaked over its surface, like sinews holding some colossal, slumbering beast in place. The air around the temple was thick, almost viscous, and tasted faintly of ozone and something else, something metallic and utterly alien. I could feel the residual energies, a faint thrumming against my teeth, a vibration in the soles of my boots. My hand trembled as I pushed aside a curtain of moss-laden vines, revealing an entrance. It wasn't a doorway, but a gaping maw, carved in the shape of something indescribable, a geometry that made my eyes ache to look at it directly. I hesitated, a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear running through me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but the signal, it pulled me. It had always pulled me. I stepped inside. They were like the signal itself, patterns designed to be understood on a level beyond language. In the center of the main chamber stood an altar, or what I presumed was an altar. This was it. This was the focal point. I carefully set up my receiver, connecting it to a series of crystalline resonators I'd brought, components tuned to the specific harmonic frequencies I'd isolated from the signal. My hands, despite my fear, moved with practiced precision, muscle memory taking over. I checked the connections, adjusted the dampeners, and then with a deep, shuddering breath, I activated it. The moment I flipped the switch, the temple itself seemed to sigh. A low thrum filled the chamber, not mechanical but organic, resonating from the very stones around me. The air crackled. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a faint, inner light, a sickly violet hue that pulsed in time with the thrumming. My receiver hummed, then screamed, overloading with the sheer intensity of the input. I felt a sudden, sharp pain behind my eyes, as if my skull was trying to split open. And then it came, not a sound, but a presence. It wasn't visual, not in any conventional sense. It was a totality, a complete sensory and cognitive immersion that shattered my perception of reality. My body vibrated, every cell singing with an impossible frequency. My mind reeled. It was formless, yet it possessed an infinite form. Not a creature, but a concept made manifest. It was teeming with an intelligence so vast, so ancient, so utterly alien that my human consciousness buckled under the strain. I wasn't seeing it with my eyes, I was experiencing it with my very being. It was a tapestry woven from space-time, a living algorithm that wrote and rewrote the laws of physics with casual indifference. Its thoughts were not thoughts, but cosmic processes, the slow, deliberate folding and unfolding of dimensions. There was no malice, no intent to harm, only an incomprehensible existence. Its purpose. It wasn't an invasion, not an attack. It was a gardener, tending to a garden so immense that stars were merely specks of pollen and galaxies were ephemeral blooms. It wasn't reshaping reality out of malevolence, but out of necessity, out of its own incomprehensible nature. The signal was merely the vibration of its cosmic breath, the ripple of its awakening. Humanity, my species, we were less than dust motes, less than the bacteria clinging to a single grain of sand on an infinite beach. Our civilizations, our triumphs, our fears, they were not even blips on its awareness. We were merely an ephemeral byproduct, a fleeting pattern that would be rearranged, dissolved, and reformed as part of its slow, inevitable reshaping of reality. Our existence was a transient ripple in its cosmic design, destined to be smoothed away without a thought. A gasp tore from my throat. My knees buckled. The world spun, not just visually, but ontologically. My hands flew to my head, pressing against my temples as if to hold my skull together. Nausea surged, a violent churning in my stomach. I could feel the static electricity crawling over my skin, the air thick with the smell of burning ozone. The violet glow of the symbols on the walls intensified, then flickered, as if the temple itself was struggling to contain the outpouring. I had sought answers and I had found them. But the truth was not a revelation, it was an annihilation. My universe, my understanding, my very self had been unmade. What remained was a shivering, insignificant awareness, adrift in an ocean of unimaginable cosmic power. What would happen when it fully stirred? I stood before the main console, the spectral patterns of the signal a pulsating, unearthly tapestry across the screens. My eyes, gritty from lack of sleep, traced the impossibly complex fluctuations. It was no longer just a signal. It was a tremor, a vibration resonating through the very fabric of existence, and I was beginning to feel it, not just in the data, but in my bones. The initial dismissals had stung, of course. The head of the department had cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze as he suggested a much-needed sabbatical. Senior researcher had mumbled about data anomalies and stress-induced interpretations. I understood their fear, their need to rationalize, but I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't unhear the silent, resonant echo that had begun to fill the spaces between my thoughts. It started subtly, beyond the lab's reinforced walls, a peculiar shift in the quality of light. I first noticed it on my walk home, the streetlights casting shadows that seemed too long, too sharp, like cuts in the twilight. The sky, usually a predictable canvas of blues and grays, began to present hues I couldn't name, purples that bled into ochres at odd times of day, like a bruise expanding across the heavens. The air, too, carried a new texture, a subtle grit that wasn't dust, but something finer, almost electrical, that made the hairs on my arms prickle. Then came the sounds, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent. A low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, a vast, subterranean pulse that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. I heard it in the quiet moments late at night when the city was supposed to be asleep, a vast, unheard chorus beneath the drone of distant traffic. It wasn't natural, it felt deliberate. The changes weren't just atmospheric. I saw them in people. I saw it in the vacant stares of commuters on the train, the way a cashier would pause. Mid-transaction, her eyes unfocused, as if listening to something only he could hear. People seemed to forget things, small details, recent events, their memories becoming porous, their focus dissolving like sugar in hot water. I felt it too, a constant pressure behind my eyes, a hum in my skull that mirrored the low thrum of the earth. I was no longer an observer. I was a part of it, a conduit, perhaps even a victim. The signal had woven itself into me and through me. It seemed to be bleeding into the world. My research shifted, driven by a terrible new clarity. I began to scour ancient texts, obscure anthropological journals, anything that hinted at phenomena defying conventional explanation. One particular recurring motif, across disparate cultures, caught my attention, a place where the veil was said to be thinnest, a site of ancient veneration and fear. It was a temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it, hidden deep within a remote, overgrown region. The few academic papers that dared to mention it spoke of its anomalous structural integrity, its impossible age, and the deep, abiding fear it inspired in any who lived near it. No one had properly explored it in centuries. The locals, when pressed, would simply turn away, their faces etched with a fear that transcended mere superstition. The entity wasn't just broadcasting, it was manifesting, and this temple felt like a focal point, an anchor in its slow, terrible unfurling. I packed a minimal kit, leaving the lab behind. The journey was arduous, a blur of cramped flights and rattling jeep rides, each mile taking me further from the world I knew and deeper into the world as it was becoming. The air grew heavy as I approached the jungle's edge, thick with humidity and the scent of decay. Even the light here was different, filtered through the dense canopy, acquiring that same bruised quality I'd seen in the city sky. My guide, a stoic local who had accepted my exorbitant payment with an unsettling lack of enthusiasm, grew increasingly withdrawn. When we reached the point where the path narrowed to an almost invisible trail, he stopped abruptly, his face pale beneath his weathered skin. He pointed wordlessly into the dense foliage, then turned and walked back, not looking once over his shoulder. He left me alone at the threshold of the unknown, with only the buzzing of unseen insects and the distant, low thrum that now seemed to rise from the very earth beneath my feet. I pushed through the tangle of vines and roots, the air growing cooler, heavier, as if I were descending into an immense, unbreathing lung. The jungle sounds receded, replaced by an unnatural quiet. Massive, lichen-encrusted stones, impossibly ancient, rose from the earth like petrified giants. No bird sang, no insect buzzed. Only the low, resonant thrum, now unmistakable, vibrated through the stones, through the air, through my own chest. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid, like old blood mixed with ozone. The walls were covered in carvings, not of gods or heroes, but of abstract, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of my vision, hinting at impossible anatomies and geometries that defied human comprehension. They were not hieroglyphs. They were maps of a reality I was only just beginning to perceive. As I moved deeper, the thrum intensified, vibrating through my bones, making my teeth ache. I could feel the entity here more acutely than anywhere else. It wasn't a signal anymore. It was a presence, vast and silent, humming just beneath the surface of my perception. It was as if the very stone was alive, resonant with a silent, terrible song. I closed my eyes, letting the vibrations wash over me, and in that moment, the world outside, the city, the colleagues, the data, all faded. There was only the temple, the thrum, and the knowledge that I was standing at the nexus of something truly ancient, truly vast, and utterly indifferent. What else had been drawn here over the millennia by this slow, terrible song? I had thought I was safe here, tucked away with my screens and my incomprehensible data. I was wrong. The world was coming for me, or rather the truth was, the shift had been insidious, creeping into the periphery of my vision first. A subtle distortion in the glass of the observation window, a momentary ripple in the air above a server rack, like heat haze where there was no heat. I'd blamed fatigue, The relentless hours spent trying to decipher the signal. But then the external reports started filtering in. Not through official channels, of course. Those were eerily quiet, filled with bland reassurances that rang hollow. No, these were snippets from independent broadcasters, frantic social media posts, and desperate pleas from remote corners of the globe. A small village in the Himalayas reported mountainsides that seemed to breathe, their ancient rock faces shifting in impassable, fluid ways. A coastal town in South America saw the ocean recede for miles, revealing seabed structures that defied geology, vast symmetrical forms that looked less like natural formations and more like forgotten architecture carved from obsidian, only for the water to rush back in moments later, erasing the impassable sight. People were calling it mass hysteria, geological anomalies, solar flares affecting perception. I knew better. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was an instruction, a blueprint, an awakening. My own senses had become unreliable. The scent of ozone, a constant companion in the lab, now sometimes carried an undertone of something else, a metallic tang mixed with a strange, damp earthiness, like soil that had never seen the sun. The air itself felt heavier, pressing in, yet at other times, inexplicably thin, making my lungs ache for substance. Then came the images, not on my screens, but in my mind. Brief, overwhelming flashes that left me gasping. They weren't memories, nor were they dreams. They twisted and turned, defying gravity, existing in spaces that folded in on themselves. And always, a sense of immense, slumbering power stirring. The signal itself had changed. It was no longer a series of complex patterns. It was a resonant hum that vibrated in my bones, a chorus of voices that spoke without sound, conveying concepts that shattered the foundations of my understanding. It wasn't guiding me with data anymore. It was pulling me. The pull grew undeniable, an ache behind my eyes, a pressure in my chest. It led me to a specific set of coordinates, relayed through the signal in a language I still didn't comprehend, yet understood implicitly. Coordinates that pointed to a dense, forgotten corner of Southeast Asia, to a place marked on no modern map, existing only in hushed legends. A place referred to only as the Temple in Jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. Leaving the lab felt like stepping out of a fragile bubble. The journey was a blur of unease. Cities felt muted, their vibrant chaos replaced by a strange, almost fearful quiet. Faces on the streets seemed vacant, eyes unfocused, as if their inner worlds were slowly dissolving. The sky, I noticed, seemed subtly wrong. The blue was deeper, yet somehow flatter, and the clouds, when they appeared, coalesced into shapes that were too sharp, too deliberate. Like chiseled stone rather than ephemeral vapor. I found a contact, a grizzled old pilot who flew cargo into remote regions. He didn't ask questions. His eyes, though, held a distant, haunted look, as if he'd seen things beyond explanation. The flight was long, the air thick with humidity and something else, something I couldn't name. As we approached the coordinates, the jungle canopy below became an unbroken expanse of green, stretching to the horizon like a wrinkled blanket. Then, through a sudden break in the clouds, I saw it, nestled deep within the emerald sprawl, an unnatural scar, not a ruin in the conventional sense, but a structure that seemed to defy the very concept of ruin. It was too massive, too alien. Stone, yes, but stone that seemed to writhe, its surfaces rippling even as I looked down from thousands of feet. Structures that appeared to be simultaneously collapsing and rising, shifting their forms in a slow, ponderous dance. My breath hitched. The pilot, sensing my gaze, grunted. "That's as close as I go. No one lands near that." His voice was rough, laced with an ancient fear. Locals, they don't even have a word for it anymore. Just. The air was thick, hot, and heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and that metallic tang I'd noticed in the lab. I pushed through the dense undergrowth, guided by an instinct stronger than any map. The deeper I went, the more the natural world seemed to fray at the edges. Trees grew at impossible angles, their trunks curving inward as if pulled by an unseen vortex. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy, then suddenly hard as polished obsidian, then spongy again. Sounds echoed strangely, the chirping of unseen insects seeming to come from behind me, then above, then from within my own skull. Finally, the jungle thinned, revealing a clearing, and there it was. The temple in jungle, locals refused to speak of it. The architecture was not of human design. Walls leaned inward at acute angles, meeting at points that should have been impossible to support. Pillars twisted like petrified rope, their surfaces adorned with carvings that shifted as I watched, flowing patterns that defied static imagery. It was a structure built on principles utterly alien, a monument to a geometry that existed outside our universe. A low, resonant thrum emanated from its core, a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but directly in my chest, my skull, my very being. The air around the temple shimmered, distorting the light, making the jungle beyond seem to ripple like water. I saw colors that had no name, hues that burned and froze simultaneously. And then I saw it. A fissure, impossibly thin and perfectly straight, appeared, then widened. From within, a faint, sickly green light pulsed, illuminating patterns that writhed and pulsed on the inner surface. It was not opening, it was unfolding. My vision swam, this was it. The awakening, the true nature of the signal the presence was manifesting, and what would be left of our reality once it did. I was wrong. The hum had become a whisper, then a directive. It wasn't the mechanical drone of servers anymore. It was a resonance deep within my bones, pulling me, urging me. I don't remember leaving the facility. The details are blurred, like trying to recall a dream immediately after waking. One moment, the cold sweat of fear and the smell of ozone. My clothes clung to me soaked. My skin felt clammy yet strangely numb. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, wet earth, and something else, something metallic and ancient, like forgotten blood on stone. I pushed through the tangled undergrowth, the rhythmic thud of my own frantic steps echoing in the unnatural quiet. No birdsong, no insect buzz, just the insistent thrumming, now seeming to emanate from the very ground beneath my worn boots. My vision, already compromised by sleepless nights, and the strain of the signal began to play tricks. Was it just the lack of light, or was something else distorting the reality around me? The path, if it could be called one, was barely discernible, choked with vines that seemed to writhe as I passed. How had I known where to go? The question felt distant, secondary to the undeniable pull forward. It wasn't a structure of human design, not entirely. Its geometry was unsettling, angles that felt wrong, perspectives that defied natural optics. There were carvings, too, not of gods or beasts, but of patterns impossibly intricate, self-repeating geometries that seemed to shift and reconfigure as I stared. They made my eyes ache, a deep, grinding pain behind my sockets. A low, guttural murmur seemed to rise from its depths, a sound that vibrated in my chest, threatening to crack my ribs. What unspeakable age did this place belong to? I approached the entrance, a gaping maw in the pyramid's base, devoid of doors. The stone felt slick, not with water, but with an oily residue that clung to my fingertips. The interior was a cavernous darkness, smelling of damp earth, stagnant water, and that strange, cold, metallic tang. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, but my feet kept moving. Unbidden, it was as if my body had been disconnected from my will, an automaton following an unseen conductor. It wasn't light, not truly. The passage sloped downwards, the floor uneven, covered in a gritty dust that crunched under my boots. The guttural murmur intensified, no longer a vibration, but a chorus, a symphony of impossible frequencies that resonated within my skull. A language without words, communicated directly to the deepest, most primordial parts of my brain. My ears began to ring, a high-pitched whine that threatened to burst my eardrums. My eyes, though straining, could make out the walls. They were not carved, but seemed to grow, organic yet stony, covered in those same shifting patterns. They swirled, coalesced, then dissolved like smoke given form. My teeth chattered, but not from fear, not entirely. It was a deep, fundamental tremor, as if my very molecular structure was being vibrated apart. Then the true event began. The pressure built, not external but internal, from behind my eyes at the base of my skull. It was as if my cranium was a vessel, and an impossible volume of liquid was being poured into it. My vision blurred, then fractured. I saw not with my eyes, but with something new, something that unfolded within my mind. Geometric shapes, not the ones on the walls, but vast, intricate constructs of pure thought, began to bloom in my inner sight. They pulsed with an alien light, shifting through dimensions I couldn't comprehend. My body spasmed, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that sent me to my knees on the gritty floor. A searing pain lanced through my brain, a white-hot agony that threatened to rip my consciousness apart. But beneath the pain, something else emerged, a profound, terrifying clarity. The hum, the murmur, the patterns, they weren't just signals. They were the very fabric of existence made manifest. The universe wasn't stars and galaxies. It was a vast, sprawling organism, an impossible architecture of consciousness, and within it the slumbering entities. I saw them. They were the true architects, the silent, dreaming gods whose very existence shaped the cosmos, and they were waking. My blood felt like static electricity, buzzing and prickling under my skin. My bones ached, felt brittle, as if they were being rearranged from within. My mind, once a fortress of logic and reason, was now a shattered window through which the infinite, terrifying truth poured. The concept of humanity seemed laughably small, a fleeting flicker in the vast cosmic night. I was no longer merely observing the signal. I was becoming a part of it, a conduit, a vessel. The pain subsided, replaced by an overwhelming sense of absorption. My individual consciousness was dissolving, merging with the alien symphony. I lifted my head, or what felt like my head. My eyes, I knew, were open, but they no longer perceived the world as they once had. The temple walls, the damp air, the faint glow, they were all transparent, overlaid with the shifting, impossible geometries of the universe's true nature. I saw the patterns on the walls not as carvings, but as echoes of the cosmic architecture, blueprints of a reality beyond human grasp. My mouth opened, but no sound came out, no human sound at least. A low, resonant hum escaped my throat, a perfect harmonic tone that vibrated through the ancient stone. I was no longer Raj, the astrophysicist. I was something else. An observer, yes, but one irrevocably altered, broken into a million pieces and reassembled with alien glue. The transformation was complete. I understood. I saw. But what was left of me, the man who had sought answers in the stars? Now that the stars themselves had been revealed as mere dust motes in a far grander, more terrible design, and what would I do with this unbearable, undeniable truth? My head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that felt less like pain and more like a physical resonance with the deep, insistent hum that had become my constant companion. The memory of leaving the facility was still a jagged void, but the direction had been clear. Unmistakable. I was here now, deep in the suffocating embrace of the jungle, and the air itself felt heavy with anticipation. The humidity clung to me like a shroud, slicking my skin, making my clothes feel like a second, clammy hide. The scent was a thick, earthy brew of decay and vibrant life, rotting leaves, damp soil, the cloying sweetness of unseen blossoms. Everything dripped. Water beaded on massive, waxy leaves, ran in rivulets down ancient tree trunks, and pooled in dark, stagnant puddles where unseen things rustled and clicked. My boots squelched with every step, the mud sucking at them, threatening to reclaim them with each effort. It was a place designed to disorient, to swallow I whole. But the hum, that silent, bone-deep directive, kept me moving. It wasn't in my ears anymore. It was in my very cells, a compass needle spun wildly by an unseen magnet, yet pointing with absolute certainty. I'd passed a scattering of huts hours ago, crude structures woven from leaves and branches, or perhaps it was fear. They refused to speak of it, of anything that lay deeper within this suffocating green heart. Their silence was a heavy, palpable thing, a warning more potent than any shouted word. They knew or they sensed, and they wanted no part of it. Then through a sudden break in the foliage, I saw it. It wasn't a grand structure, not in the way one might imagine. It was less built, more grown. Massive, lichen-stained stone blocks wrestled with the jungle itself, roots like colossal serpents coiling around crumbling walls, tendrils of vines throttling ancient carvings. Mosses of an unnatural, luminous green clung to every surface, lending the edifice an otherworldly glow in the dim light. It looked less like a place of worship and more like a scar, an ancient wound on the face of the earth, slowly being consumed by the very life around it. A gaping archway, choked with vegetation, beckoned. The hum intensified, a vibrating current running through my teeth, making my vision swim at the edges. My legs felt heavy, yet they kept moving, carrying me forward as if by a will not entirely my own. I stepped over a threshold worn smooth by millennia into a vast central chamber. The ceiling had long since collapsed in places, allowing shafts of weak, filtered light to pierce the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced like phantom entities. The walls were covered in carvings, not of human figures or recognizable beasts, but of impossible geometries, repeating patterns that twisted and turned, defying logic, hinting at dimensions that folded in on themselves. My eyes ached trying to follow them, my mind protesting the inherent wrongness of their design. In the center of the chamber, where an altar might have once stood, was the source. It wasn't a device, it wasn't a relic, it was a space. It absorbed the meager light, creating an absolute absence, a hole in reality. No, not a hole, it was a presence, a palpable weight that pressed in on my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. It didn't reflect, it consumed. It pulsed with the hum, now a deafening internal roar, vibrating every bone, every nerve ending. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer impossibility of it. My knees buckled. I fell to the rough stone floor, my hands scraping against the gritty surface. The world tilted. The patterns on the walls began to shift, to breathe, the lines extending and contracting, no longer static carvings but living diagrams of unimaginable forces. The air itself shimmered, growing thin and sharp. And then I saw, not with my eyes, with something deeper, something that tore through the veil of my skull, ripped open the fragile membrane of my consciousness. It was a window into the true architecture of existence. And through it, I glimpsed the architects. They were not beings in any sense I could comprehend. They were vast, formless currents of thought, eddies in an ocean of pure, unadulterated consciousness that spanned the gulfs between cosmic structures. They were the hum, the signal, the directive, and I was not Raj anymore. I was a tremor, a fleeting thought, a single, insignificant resonance in their boundless, slumbering awareness. The world shattered around me, not with sound, but with the silent, overwhelming force of absolute truth. The jungle, the temple, my own body, they all became translucent, shimmering illusions, their forms dissolving into the impossible geometries that now swam before my inner eye. The air I breathed tasted of forever. The stone beneath my hands was not solid, but a fleeting arrangement of energy, temporary and fragile. I was no longer in the temple. I was in the hum. I was of the hum. My identity, my memories, my very sense of self began to fray, unraveling like a cheap thread pulled from a cosmic tapestry. The individual threads of my being were rewoven, not into something new, but into an echo of something infinitely vast, infinitely old. I was a whisper in a storm, a flicker in an eternity. What was I now? A fragment of thought in a universe that had always been a dream within a greater dream.